and thank you, Reese, for that speech. We now return to our paper speakers. We'll begin on the proposition once again. Elizabeth Appel is an MPhil student of Engineering for Sustainable Development studying at King's College. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak in this chamber. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm a white woman here to speak on a debate topic that deals heavily with race-based discrimination. And I hope my words today will spark introspection for those here who, like me, have spent a majority of our lives complicit in these systems and insulated by privilege. I'm not a social scientist. As you heard, I'm an engineer. And so tonight I'm going to introduce you all to an engineering concept called outcome-oriented design. When designing a system to solve a complex problem, a common trap that governments, companies, engineers alike, we all fall into it, is that we approach the problem with the product in mind. When we're looking at how to connect community A to community B, we start asking ourselves, what does the road look like? Instead of asking ourselves if a road is actually the proper solution at all. When investigating the problem of how do we live in a more just and peaceful society, we ask ourselves, how do we reform policing? When maybe the question is policing the correct tool at all? This lock-in, this focus on policing, driven by the belief that more reform, more money, more officers on the street will solve the problem, not only one, devalues and demeans the lived trauma of thousands of victims of police violence, but also secondly, distracts us from pursuing more radical changes to address the core questions of crime and belonging in our communities. In good engineering, we focus on outcomes, not products. So, let's define our desired outcome. A working police system would maintain a society in which all persons can contribute equally without sacrificing the liberty of others. It's a pretty broad definition. For the sake of clash, I'm going to ask the opposition to prove to you all today that policing has the realistic capacity to fully deliver on that promise. I'm going to argue that even if a police system works in reducing crime rates on paper, it cannot be considered a working police system if the reduction in crime comes at the expense of the lives and liberties of innocent people. Further, I'm going to argue that, on the whole and as an institution, policing cannot work. In the UK, there's been a recent 20% rise in miscarriage of justice applications in just the last year. Over 1,500 UK police officers in 2023 were accused of violence and sexual misconduct against women and young girls, only resulting in 13 being sacked. In the American policing system, over 600 people are killed by police each year. That's double the capacity of this entire chamber, mowed down by law enforcement. Policing is not working. Policing, as the state-sanctioned use of force to coerce behavior in line with predefined standards, is not working because of factors that will never change. My argument stands on three core pillars. First, policing will always recreate structures of power. Two, policing reform is impossible. And three, alternatives policing are necessary and more successful. Let's begin with the first pillar. Policing will always recreate structures of power. State-sanctioned violence against private citizens is not carried out by objective or altruistic actors. It's carried out by individual officers who harbor both conscious and completely unconscious bias. Racism, colorism, and policing are so intertwined, it's impossible to untangle them. Afro-pessimist scholars have highlighted for decades the inherent inequities in society produced by colonial structures that we will never remove. Just last year, a study by UC Berkeley concluded that training programs for police focusing on cultural awareness, diversity, and fairness don't actually cause a reliable decrease in discriminatory policing practices. The Minneapolis Police Department in the US that murdered George Floyd received millions of dollars in procedural justice, implicit bias prevention, and de-escalation training before the murder occurred. In the UK, 10 Black and minority ethnic officers have recently left the Metropolitan Police Department after telling the BBC that white officers, quote, treated them like animals and faced little punishment, if any, at all. The UK's chair of the National Police Chiefs Council has reported that little progress has been made to reform the police, and it's even when progress is attempted that there's significant resistance from those in power. Some attempts have been made to diversify police forces themselves, notably in post-apartheid South Africa, where a once fully white police force is now 20% white. Yet, these efforts yielded no reduction in police violence towards Black South Africans. In fact, post-apartheid South African police kill more innocent civilians per capita than American police. Beyond South Africa, studies have found that diversifying officer race to mirror the communities they serve does not reduce police-involved homicides. Police brutality is thus endemic, rather than a symptom of some political period. Gender also plays a substantial role in the power dynamics between police officers and citizens. In the United States, transgender and gender-diverse people are 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when interacting with the police than their cisgender counterparts. The UK's predominantly male police force reports abuse of position for sexual purposes is the single biggest form of corruption. Internally, 43% of female police officers in the UK report being victims of sexual harassment from their fellow officers. Policing as an institution will always replicate racist, homophobic, and patriarchal structures, and for that reason, it cannot work. Second, police reform is impossible. I would like to recognize and appreciate the work that Mr. George, one of the opposition speakers, does each and every day. It's incredibly impactful, it's incredibly meaningful, and by standing in proposition, I'm not disvaluing that. Instead, I'm recognizing that his battle is never ending, that the fight to make police just, the fight to make police a just working institution will never end because policing inherently has these issues. It can't work, and that's why people like Mr. George are so critical, and unfortunately, again, their work is never ending. Police are set up to fail from the start. They're chronically underfunded, asked to perform under duress, and psychologically prone to abuses of power. None of these issues are for the individual bad apple officer, but there are structural deficiencies in policing as an institution. The inherent resource scarcity of governments means that police will never have infinite resources to carry out endless reforms. Every penny given to police could have gone to affordable housing, education, mental health programs. In approaching debates like this, it's critical to recognize the actual practical realities of what policing can achieve. When performing under duress, officers have to exercise discretion. This is where mistakes get made and bias slips in. Corrections for this, the attempt to reduce discretionary actions taken by officers consistently falls short. Removing discretion from officers and handing it over to AI algorithms, something the LAPD has tried to do, has been proven to replicate discriminatory policing. Regulations placed on officers such as mandatory body cameras, like the opposition speaker mentioned, are constantly resisted, with officers in the UK being found to turn off their cameras, delete footage, and even share footage of their own interactions with private citizens in private WhatsApp messages between officers. Finally, the psychological structure of police hierarchies makes reform impossible. On the individual level, the social dominance metric, which is a measure of how much affinity a person has for hierarchical social structures and how highly they place themselves in them, has been shown to increase when people are given positions of power. At the departmental level, police officers with high numbers of complaints against them for excessive use of force are found to be rated to be higher performing police officers by their superiors. Finally, at the macro level, countless studies have found policing as the enforcement of the highest standards of security and social order use a utilitarian rationalization of excessive violence, and thus this violence is sanitized through professional language. Murdered civilians become collateral damage. Roughing someone up starts to mean less when your higher power is much higher and mightier. This psychology, inherent to the minds of human beings, prevents reform from working, and that is why policing cannot work. Third, alternatives to policing work where policing fails. In the engineering world, if you design a solution and it only works half the time for half its users, it doesn't actually work. Similarly, if your solution requires constant patching, constant support, that solution also doesn't work. Policing studies across the globe have found that increased policing through increased officer presence cannot be statistically linked to a causal reduction in crime. Further, there's no statistically significant relationship between increasing police funding and crime reduction. Crime can be seen as a symptom of a larger disease. And instead of just focusing on that symptom, let's look at the actual root of the problem. Cities can build smarter to reduce crime. Strategies like improving green space, shuttering abandoned buildings, and improving lighting can have massive impacts on opportunistic crime. Community building and socialization programs have been proven to reduce crime rates through improving community cohesion. Improving access to drug rehabilitation, decriminalization of nonviolent drug offenses, and improving access to mental health services have also all statistically, causally been proven to reduce crime. These approaches don't treat symptoms, they get down to the root of the problem. Yes?
A reduction in crime does not mean an absence of crime. So without a police force, who do you call?
I'm going to touch on that later. The existence of additional programs to stand in for policing shortcomings is a testament to the fact that policing is an inherently imperfect system. It will always have gaps. It will always leave people behind. That is why these alternative community-based programs are so important. When we accept that policing cannot work, we give actual legitimacy to the very important work that these programs do in addressing the root causes of crime. For as long as we keep lying to ourselves and believing that policing is the solution, we are locking ourselves out of transformative approaches to justice. Many of you here tonight, and I'm sure the opposition, are going to urge this House to turn to police reform. You will ask me, who will I call if someone breaks into my house in the middle of the night? You will ask me, who will get all the serial killers and child predators off the street? Policing will always exist. I'm a realist, I'm an engineer. Partially because oppressive power structures will always exist. And I'd like to push you all again to that point I made earlier about outcome-oriented design. Challenge yourselves to think of a world where policing is not the sole executor of justice in the streets, where the control of state-sanctioned force is not the sole responsibility of the police. By standing in proposition of the motion today, I'm not advocating for a world in which we walk out of this chamber, flip a magical switch, and fire all police officers immediately. But I'm advocating for us to recognize the inherent and omnipotent fallibility of policing, its inability to be fully reformed, and its capacity to carry out both structural and physical violence against the people it pledges to protect. For these reasons, I stand in proposition of the motion that this House believes policing cannot work. I hope this stance does not inspire pessimism, but instead ignites a fire for innovation, for those seeking alternative policy methods to achieve truly just outcomes. By standing in proposition of the motion, you all tonight can become engineers and solve one of the most complex, pervasive issues facing society today. Thank you.